Bob, what say you, man? What is going on college campuses right now?
I think they're just trying to divide us. I mean, it's the BLM rioters all over again with a new mask, and it's Soros is funding all this. It's just to divide us. And you see some of the schools we're canceling classes for the year. It's like, come on, man.
Well, what I'm trying to figure out, and I guess that this just goes to show that it's not necessarily aimed at one political party. It's just about creating this environment of chaos and political discontent, is that the protesters at the college campuses are very much vehemently anti-Biden because the Biden administration has taken a very pronounced pro-Israel position. And these people are there. There was even a clip, I'm sure some of you saw it, where you had on one half the anti-protesters, the counter-protesters, the MAGA guys, and then on the other side you have the Antifa wearing the cloths, the checkered flags, whatever the hell those things are. They're wearing them, free Palestine, pro-Hamas, but they all start chanting, F Joe Biden.
Yeah.
All of them in unison. So look, Joe Biden has managed to unify the country.
Jesus.
Say what you will. We're just waiting for Carlin to get here. Let's see if she's here. She is here. Look at that. I didn't even hear her come in. We're going to bring her in because we got to get her position on all this. Because again, Bob, I fear that you and I are looking at this through a very narrow lens.
Yeah.
And what Carlin's going to do is she's going to say, guys, it's like the iceberg and you're the Titanic. You only see the little tip of it, but there's so much more under the surface. You don't even understand the half of it. And I don't. And, as much as I like hosting the show, I like being a guest on my own podcast and sitting back and listening. And Carlin is one of the best guests you can have. Dr. Carlin, she's earned that title. I'm very much in favor of title dictating behavior. So I'm going to bring her in. She's not a stranger to you. You've seen her. You know who she is. She is so politically homeless. She's camped out on my driveway right now. Young Grata. You love her, you hate her, whatever the case may be, but you have to respect her. Dr. Carlin Borysenko. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me, Eric. Glad to be here. I'm doing well. It's been, I got to tell you, like a really busy couple of weeks because I've been deep in trying to follow as much primary source protest footage as I can. And there's a lot to talk about. And you're exactly right in your analysis of what I'm going to tell you, because conservative media has gotten so much stuff wrong, and I can't wait to dig into it.
Okay, so I'm going to sit here. I'm going to play the role of a low information citizen and go, these are anti-Semitic protests. And that's the extent of my analysis. Where am I wrong?
They are not anti-Semitic at all. In fact, there are Jewish people involved in the protests. They've held Shabbat dinner at the protests. They celebrated Passover at the protests. The students at Columbia actually very early on after they started their encampment had a press conference in which they featured the Jewish students saying, like, we're Jewish and we're on this side, and it's because we're Jewish that we're on this side. And so I do think it's a very it is a conservative narrative that this is about anti-Semitism. I had actually it's funny because, and this was just a pure coincidence, I had two members of the Revolutionary Communists of America on my YouTube channel 2 weeks ago to just kind of have a chat to talk about their perspectives. I never get communists to actually talk to me, so it was interesting for me to actually hear from them. And one of the things that they said to me that I think is really important for this conversation, and it was just like an off-the-cuff remark on their part, is they were talking about how they define the word intifada. Now, if I say the word intifada to you, what does that mean to you?
Intifada, as you know, in my very narrow understanding of Arabic, is kind of like a jihad, like a holy crusade.
Okay, so and I understand why you have that perspective on it. How the far left in the United States, at least, is defining intifada is a worldwide socialist revolution. And so when you're seeing these kids on campus and they're saying intifada, and by the way, the Revolutionary Communists of America are one of the groups that are organizing on campuses. Their stickers were actually all over the UCLA encampment. When they're saying intifada, what they mean is a worldwide socialist revolution, because how leftists in general perceive this is they're not against Israel because of anyone being Jewish. They're against Israel because Israel are the settler colonists who have colonized the indigenous Palestinian land. I'm not saying I agree with them. I'm explaining their perspective. They've colonized the indigenous Palestinian land, opposing the oppressive force of capitalism, because capitalism just means private property to the far left. And so what they see is that the Palestinians are rising up in the glorious revolution to overthrow the evil capitalist oppressor. So it really has nothing to do with them being Jewish at all. It is just a bourgeois proletariat oppressor-oppressed narrative, and it happens to be playing out in this way. And so when the left is looking at this situation, they're seeing something that's very, very different than what the right's seeing.
My perspective on it, as far as the settler, the oppressed, that kind of narrative that we've been hearing for the last probably 10 or 12 years, namely originating on college campuses, what I've seen from my viewing of these protests is you have a lot of these people chanting, like telling the Jewish people to go back to Europe, so that the Jewish people who settled in that region of the world are European. Europeans are white. Palestinians are Arabs, people of color. Is there a racial dynamic to all of this that enables them to, I guess, cloak any anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism along these racial lines that we've grown really accustomed to with these protests?
No, there's really not. And again, like I was watching the live videos actually filmed by leftists from the encampment at Columbia, where some of the lead organizers in that specific encampment are white. Like, they're very, very, very white. And so, and what they're talking about is not only do they want to tear down the oppressor that is Israel oppressing the Palestinians, they're also very anti-war. So there is actually still an anti-war left, ironically. And it happens to be on the college encampments right now. And they also believe in tearing down, and get this actually leads back to, we've been, in my community, we've been going over a lot of like queer anarchist literature, like anarcho-communist literature lately, which is about as exciting as it sounds. But there is actually a tradition in anarcho-communist literature talking about tearing down the capitalist universities, because the left perceives, and I know this sounds funny because we think that the universities are all totally leftist and totally on board with this communist agenda, but the radical revolutionary far left perceives that the university has capitulated to capitalism and has bent the knee and only seeking to train workers to support capitalism and all that stuff. And I actually watched an interview with one of the lead organizers at Columbia, who is very white, and he was saying exactly the same thing. He was calling it an illegitimate institution. If you watch videos of these kids, they're calling for the tearing down of the illegitimate institutions. And so there's no racial component to this. There's no anti-Semitism component to this. I'm not going to say you aren't going to find onesies and twosies, because these are massive protests, right? You're going to, like, you guys know this better than anyone, right? Like, the protests bring out the crazy people. There's also plants that are coming from both sides, by the way, to film video for social media to get those owns. Like, there was a video of a woman that was basically like holding a sign at the Columbia protest that basically was calling for like the killing of Jews. A lot of people are saying that she was actually Jewish, and she was trying to set that up to go viral on social media to cause problems for the people actually camping out. So I think there's a lot more to this than people understand, but you always have to remember that the number one goal of the far left in America is to abolish capitalism, which they define as private property ownership, and they have framed this entire situation in that perspective.
So I think this takes it a step farther than, like, when we think back to the summer of love, 2020, we think back to BLM, and Trump was in office, and we really saw that as kind of an uprising against Trump. I mean, very famously, politicians on the left came up as, there should be uprisings in the streets. Nancy Pelosi saying that, Kamala Harris going on Stephen Colbert and saying, this is not going to stop. We're going to support these people. But now you have a Democrat in the White House, and you have history repeating itself. So I think this goes so far beyond Trump and Biden. This is not, there is necessarily no candidate allegiance with the left. It's a system they're trying to topple, and Biden and Trump to them represent the same thing.
Yeah, I joined just as you are at the tail end of talking about how that one crowd at the university where both sides were chanting F Joe Biden. And actually, like, so this is something that I've been trying to explain this to the right for a while now. The radical revolutionary left are not Democrats. they hate Democrats. The radical revolutionary left actually talks more about how much they hate Democrats than they talk about how much they hate conservatives. They rarely talk about conservatives in the political right at all. It's all about the neoliberals, the neoliberals, the neoliberals, because they view the Democratic Party as having, again, capitulated to capitalism. This also extends to people who you might think the far left would like AOC and Bernie Sanders. They hate them. They actually view AOC and Bernie Sanders as traitors to their cause. And so what we're talking about is this is an extreme, radical, militant arm of the far left. And I've been trying to tell people for years now, Eric, that these people there are more of these people than people think. This is a much bigger problem than people think. This is not just crazies on college campuses. And now we're seeing that play out all over the country where, is it starting on college campuses? But a lot of those people on the college campuses are not the college students. They're actually these far leftist groups that are coming in to organize the college students. And where you're really going to freak out is when I tell you these groups are not funded by George Soros.
Who are they funded by?
They're self-funded. These are self-funded groups. We've got the Party of Socialism and Liberation. We've got Within Our Lifetime. We got the People's Forum, NYC. We've got the Revolutionary Communists of America. These groups actually, there are all sorts of socialist collectives running around. These groups actually have in their charters a lot of the time that they will not take outside money, because remember, these are radical militants. This is part of who they are, is part of their identity. And they believe that if they take money from the big NGOs, which, by the way, they don't like George Soros. George Soros, again, too close to capitalism, that's going to corrupt their political movement. So it's not like, if you really get into the weeds of things, it's not like you can't find George Soros funded this one scholarship that went to this person that happens to be associated with this group. You can find onesie and twosie connections like that. But the fact is that if they had all this money, they would have bought much better tents than what they did. I think that what happened with the tent situation, and by the way, not all the tents on the encampment were the same. If you actually look at the footage from inside the encampment, they were all different. But this is like a case of a rich kid having daddy's credit card, going onto Amazon, buying 10 tents off of Amazon. In New York City, they get delivered the very same day. And so it's one of those situations where they shared a link in a group chat or something. We actually saw situations after they took over Hamilton Hall and they renamed it. So do you guys remember the following day when they made this list of demands after they took over the building and they said, we want people to feed us, send us food, send us food. Well, what they did is they ended up ordering takeout to hoist up the building in these little pulleys that they had made, but they didn't even have that much money to buy that food. So where is all this money coming from if they can't even buy takeout to send up to the people who took over this building? A lot of these organizations do run on a shoestring budget. They are funded mainly through membership dues. There are some organizations that require their members to pay 1 day's salary per month as part of their membership dues. They're funded by event ticket sales, that they run events and trainings and workshops and things like that. They're funded by donations because there are all these mutual aid networks. They all donate. The socialist left is a very insular ecosystem. They all basically just give each other money. And the big way that a lot of these groups are funded is actually publishing. So publishing houses that publish socialist books, a lot of their materials, even if you go to a socialist event, even if they're giving you a pamphlet, they're going to charge you money for that pamphlet. It's not free. And so so that's how a lot of these groups are funded. And that's how they keep the ideology pure within the movement.
My question is, why this specific issue of all the atrocities in all the world, of all the things going on at any given time, North Korea, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, why this particular issue, and why this particular moment? Why now?
So I think there are a couple veins to this. Number one, the Free Palestine issue has been around for a long time. I was on the left for 20 years. You guys know, there was never a time when I was on the left that the Free Palestine issue was not a major issue on the left. However, I actually have video of Angela Davis from right after October 7th. Actually, she was doing a webinar with socialist book publisher Haymarket Books. And Angela Davis herself said flat out that the social justice left co-opted the Free Palestine movement and they absorbed it into the radical revolutionary social justice left. So that's part of what it is. This was something that already existed that they co-opted, that, and they're kind of like different interest groups in it. There are people within it that are purely focused on the Free Palestine issue, and that's always been their thing, and that's all they talk about, and that's all they do. There are also people in it who are just radical revolutionary leftists who are trying to take advantage of this issue to use it to push their ideology. So what the second aspect of this, though, is just, it was the issue. I mean, we all thought that there was going to be some sort of summer of love attempt in 2024. I think that that's pretty obvious to anyone paying attention. But last year at this time, we thought it was going to be around someone trying to kill a trans person, and that was going to set off riots in the same way that Floyd set off riots. People were calling it Trans Floyd and stuff like that. And so, and that, by the way, could still happen, and I wouldn't actually rule that out. But when October 7th happened, that changed the game. And then that became the focal point. That became the issue that the left rallied around. And it was a little bit like George Floyd in that sense, in that, do you guys remember way back in the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020 when we all kind of first met? And it was like when the pandemic first started, before anyone knew what was going on, it was an actual problem, right? Like, people actually kind of took it seriously. It was a real thing. And what happened is the social justice left got so quiet at the beginning of the pandemic. It's like they had been reeing all throughout 2019, and then all of a sudden they weren't saying anything. And then George Floyd happened, and they shot out of a cannon because they saw an issue that they could take advantage of. They didn't care about George Floyd. It was about the issue that they could take advantage of to cause problems. It's kind of the same thing with October 7th, in that it's something that just happened. No one planned for it. But my God, the left is really good at taking advantages of situations in order to cause problems. And people are talking about how, you know, these protests on college campuses are too big and too organized to not be funded by these big dollar NGOs or whatever. But people have to remember, the college students have been protesting and organizing for months, literally months. And there's been all sorts of media coverage about this. They've been getting slammed for it. They've been losing their job opportunities for it. And the protests just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until finally they started these encampments. And I think that, you know, I personally think we're only going to see them escalating. We're not going to see this going away. Even as we're clearing out they're clearing out the college encampments, they're still protesting. The students in Columbia and CUNY were outside of the Columbia president's house just the other night, just like screaming at her at midnight. And it was just, so the UCLA students are still organizing. So we're only going to see this continue to get bigger.
Carlin, you had said something maybe a week or two ago. You were making comparisons between, or not drawing comparisons, but making allusions to Kent State. Mm-hmm. And that just sent a shiver down my spine. I'm like, holy cow, you know, we're in May of 2024. If we remember, you know, May of 2020, we're in the pandemic. All of a sudden, May 25th, George Floyd, the video hit, and it was like a powder keg. We've been cooped up for 8 weeks. The country was in just disarray. We still couldn't figure things out, what was happening. And now you have this issue, and you're 100% right. The far left saw, aha, opportunity, and jumped on it and blew it up into this movement. The Summer of Love kicked off. We're in May. I mean, obviously, I think the most likely scenario for that would be, God forbid, and we've seen videos out of, you know, I guess traditionally red states, Florida, Texas, Mississippi, where the police are far more aggressive than they've been in California and New York. God forbid a student protester or agitator or anyone on the left is killed. What happens?
Yeah, and actually today is the anniversary of Kent State. And so there are actually going to be all these rallies all over the country where they are specifically going to be talking about this issue. And I said the same thing, Eric. I said, if the Kent State thing is going to happen, it's going to happen in a place like Florida, where Ron DeSantis wants to prove that he's a big, tough man and he's not going to allow these protesters to take over campuses. I got to tell you, when I saw the video coming out of, I think it's the University of South Florida out of Tampa, where there was like a really small encampment, but we're talking like 3 tents, and one of them was kind of turned on its side. It wasn't even a real thing. And you had these students like just sitting on the lawn and kind of holding their signs and chanting their chants. And what happened is the police came, fired tear gas on them, fired rubber bullets on them, and literally it's just a group of students that was sitting on a lawn. And I sat there looking at that going, where have I seen this before? Because I was at January 6th and I remember standing on a lawn and literally having tear gas fired at me, and it didn't and it hit, the tear gas canister hit a guy that was standing right in front of me. That was a real fun experience for me. But you gotta to watch that happen. I know that people don't agree with the college protesters, and you don't have to agree with their position to say that someone should be allowed to sit on a lawn and hold a sign and chant a chant at a public university and not get tear gas fired on them by the cops. And I think this is one of those issues that's not just galvanizing the far left, by the way. There are a lot of people on the right who are not supportive of what is going on and us just sending another $30 billion to Israel, and they're not supportive of funding this war. And then to see that these protesters are kind of on their side, this has been a really galvanizing issue for people on the right that I don't think everyone understands, and it's kind of splitting the right in that regard. But I share your sentiment. I'm scared to death of what happens the minute that one of these protesters throws a rock and hits a cop, and the cop pulls out their gun and bang, 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 and then we've got another Kent State because they're going to fire indiscriminately into a crowd, and it only takes one person to do it, and that would kick off nationwide unrest.
Karlan, before we come back to that, I want to touch on something that you had talked about, and talking about this idea of sitting on a lawn and being able to protest. Now, I'm going to challenge the intellectual consistency of our listeners and those that supported January 6th as a free exercise of speech and peaceful assembly. Now, guys, if you supported that, then why not support college students who want to occupy public space and want to speak their mind? And I come to you as, I'm Jewish. My mother's Jewish. My grandfather looks like Anwar Sadat. You know, and if you're born of a Jewish woman, you're considered to be Jewish. I have absolutely no problem from a free speech perspective with anti-Semitism. I think it's ignorant, like any form of bigotry. I think it's just coming from a place of not being educated. But you have a right in this country to be a bigot. You have a right to be narrow-minded. If the Ku Klux Klan wanted to come into my neighborhood and they had a permit for a cross burning, that's a free exercise of speech. And there was a time, Skokie, Illinois, Google it, where the ACLU represented the Ku Klux Klan to have a rally. They said, hey, we hate what these guys stand for, but if you abridge their free speech, you abridge mine as well. So the Republican Party, of course, in their heads up their collective asses, Tim Scott coming out, we're not going to tolerate anti-Semitism. Well, that's a bunch of bullshit. You will tolerate anti-Semitism because in this country, you have the right to be anti-Semitic. Why are Republicans playing, just looking, 10 yards ahead when the conservatives doing what they always do, narrow-minded, going, we're going to treat this as anti-Semitism, and then trying to pass this legislation that effectively curtails free speech? I see another Patriot Act in the works. Why can't conservatives get out of their little boxes and go, wait a minute, there are corollaries between January 6th and this. Where can we draw distinctions between free speech and, infringing upon the rights of others? And I think those of us that are of reasonable minds of January 6th will say assembling, protesting, okay. Breaking windows, beating up cops, not okay. Can we have some consistency here?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, Eric, that what I think happened is right after October 7th started and we started seeing these college protests kick off nationwide, there started being a narrative built on the conservative right that anyone who sided with these protesters and was against funding this war that Israel is perpetrating, and I personally, honestly, and people might disagree with me, I do believe Israel is perpetrating a genocide. I really do. We can disagree, that's fine. But there were a lot of people that were against this, and there started to be this narrative that was built on the conservative right that said, if you are against what Israel is doing in Gaza, you are aligned with BLM. You are aligned with the far left. And I'm sitting over here going, I literally have been exposing the far left for 3 years, and you want to tell me that because I don't approve of funding a foreign war and what I perceive to be a genocide, I'm now a far leftist? I don't accept that. And the fact is that a lot of people on the right did not accept that narrative, but it was a narrative that was pushed to an awful lot of people. And what I think it did is it created this reactionary audience on the right who were saying that anything that the left supports, we are going to be against just on principle, not on the principle of what the topic was, but on principle of everything the left does is bad, and so we have to be on the opposite side of whatever the left does. And I think a lot of what I remember about the right when I red pilled and woke up in 2020, or in 2019, but I really kind of came out in 2020, was that they were talking about individual liberties. They were talking about free speech. There were literally years that conservatives were complaining about the censorship of conservative ideas on college campuses. There was literally a bill that Trump signed about, like, you know, being able to talk about conservative ideas on campuses. And now, like, they're kind of turning around and doing exactly the same thing to the left that the left did to them. And when you do that, you don't look ideologically consistent to people like me. I mean, you mentioned I'm politically homeless. I'm actually pretty much in like the anarcho-capitalist camp. I'm anti-war. I'm anti-genocide. I'm anti-government. I basically want to like wipe the whole thing out. So I actually feel like my position is pretty clear. But the problem with my position is that sometimes it ends up aligning me more with people on the left who are also anti-war than it does with people on the right who right now are arguing to fund the war.
That's the thing. And I think it's just a byproduct of our tribalism, that it's just, and again, there are forces greater than ourselves that want to create that us versus them dichotomy. Because as long as we're sitting here, you know, lobbing insults at each other, they can put us in foreign wars. They can rob us blind. Inflation can go through the roof, and nobody gets ahead. It really is, you know, it's not us versus them, Democrats versus Republicans. It's us versus them. It's us versus the power structure. It's us versus the government. And I think you could have the most hope to die anarcho-capitalist, liberal, and, you know, dyed-in-the-wool MAGA, you know, red, white, and blue American who would actually agree on a lot of things, not stylistically, but substantially. Like, we look at, you know, Washington as a big uniparty. We look at our government as corrupt. I mean, they're telling us, oh, look at what Putin's doing. We're jailing political opponents. We're putting protesters in here. You know, we have, say what you will about Trump. You know, we have a former president who's been indicted on 91 counts by his successor. So to say that we're any better than Putin, or that I need to cast aspersions at him, or I need to take a side in that conflict, when we have our own human rights violations here, I think that says something. But as far as it goes with respect to maintaining consistency, I want cooler heads to prevail. And I want us to step outside of our tribal boxes and step outside of our echo chambers and go, look, you know, college, first of all, college protest is nothing new. Let's not sit and go, oh my God, campus craziness. You know, I'm the child of baby boomers. You know, our parents protested in the 60s. Like, this has been going on for a long time. I graduated college in 2004. When I graduated, there were protests. There were anti-Bush, anti-Iraq protests right through the quad I would walk through on the way to class. So college students, you know, young people in general, it's a part of growing up. That's your rebellion. Let's take on the system. We're going to change the world. We all feel that way when we're 22. And by the time we're 42, it's like, I just want to pay my mortgage and find a place to park. We say that tongue in cheek, but that's really, when you're young, you want to take on the world. And I applaud that to some degree. The issue is when you have these outside agitators coming in who are encouraging otherwise good-intentioned people to, let's occupy these buildings to the point where we're preventing other people from leaving or entering. Let's go harass Jewish students or whomever on campus. Let's break windows. Let's vandalize, which is the same thing we saw on January 6th. I firmly believe January 6th was well-intentioned. I don't think people got together and said, let's overthrow our government. These are Americans that said, I'm upset with what happened, and I want to go have my voice heard. And you had agitators who were saying, hey, let's go take the building. Let's break windows. Let's assault cops, who should be prosecuted in a manner that's commensurate with anyone else who commits those crimes. But I think what we're going to see here is no real consequences for those who went on Columbia campus or whatever college and broke the law, not just sitting on a quad and holding up a sign, but breaking windows, fighting with police, harassing other students. I've already heard Alvin Bragg, his office, saying they're probably not going to prosecute anybody.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that what people need to realize, I mean, and I agree with you, and I think it is important to point out that, like, a lot of these colleges have traditions of, like, having protests on campus. Actually, it was funny because the day that they raided Columbia's campus was like it was the anniversary of when they raided it in the 1968 protests. And so it's like the exact day. They're trying to create that tradition. And so I do think there's something to that. I also think, though, that people need to understand that things have changed a lot since you and I were in college, Eric, because what happened is that basically, so we all know that the far left has been trying to take over K through 12 education for a really, really, really long time. They completed that task right around 2008, 2009, 2010. What happened is they started installing equity departments in school districts all over the country. There's an equity department in almost every single school district, even in red states. Equity is Marxism. This is how they're teaching these ideas to the students. And so what we're seeing is that every single student in those college protests today have been indoctrinated into a far left political ideology since they were 5 years old, to greater or lesser extents, depending on where exactly they went to school. But they've been getting this literally their entire lives. We didn't have that. Like Bob didn't have that. I didn't have that. You didn't have that when we were in school. And so they are coming to college in a very different place. And then college, and especially Columbia is like ground zero for the Frankfurt School. It's where they set up shop when they came to the United States. College just reinforces that and radicalizes it even further. We saw on some of these college campuses, the people who were standing up for the students were the faculty. The faculty were doing walkouts. They were doing protests. The faculty were literally forming the security lines to protect the students at both Columbia and UCLA and probably other places too. And so this is where these ideas are coming from. And I feel badly for these students to a certain extent because, to be quite frank, we've all failed them. We have all failed them by allowing them to spend their entire lives in an educational system that has indoctrinated them into a far left cult. And I do believe that the far left is a cult, and they're very insular. They only talk to each other. They only reinforce each other's ideas. And this is why this is happening right now. And I got to tell you, I think the biggest mistake, actually, no, I think there were two mistakes that were made in this scenario. The mistake that Columbia made was at the very beginning of the protest, when the students were just sitting around on the lawn before they had done anything illegal. And they were setting up tents, fine. But like when the students were just sitting around on the lawn, the Columbia University's president called the NYPD to campus to arrest the students, even though they weren't doing anything wrong at that point. That was a big deal. The NYPD had not been allowed on Columbia's campus since 1968. And so for her to call the police that early, it really pissed off the students, because the students, like, one of the main issues on the far left is they are anti-police. They are defund the police, abolish the prison industrial complex. And so for the police to be called to Columbia's campus for the first time in 1968, when the students were just sitting around on the lawn, that was a big problem. That was a big mistake. And that quadrupled the size of the protest overnight. And so I really think if Columbia had just kind of let them go and let them do their thing, it probably would have fizzled out. But do you know what the great irony of this whole thing is? That what I think actually set this off was Columbia's president being called by Republicans to testify in front of Congress in the first place, to account for the anti-Semitism on campus, because the day that Columbia's president testified, that was the day they started the encampment. They used her congressional testimony in order to tee everyone up, in order to actually make this happen. And so if there's a very real scenario in which if Republicans had just left well enough alone, had just said, I don't agree with anti-Semitic speech, but people are allowed to have it. Had they just not called Columbia's president and the board of trustees to testify in front of Congress, we might be in a very different reality right now, because that was what the students were responding to.
Mm-hmm. Do you see a difference in the response of officials to this protest than you did with BLM in 2020? I saw BLM in 2020, they let it go on. Now you actually see a concerted effort to stop it.
Yeah, I see a big difference in it. And I'll say the quiet part out loud. I think that difference is Israel. And listen, I don't care if people are Jewish. It doesn't make a difference. Like, Eric, I consider you a friend. Like, we've been friends for a while now. You're one of the best guys I know. But like I gotta admit, it's just like it is shocking to me watching the armies of literal armies. They're calling out battalions of police officers to quell these college campus protests after a couple of weeks, because they are against what's going on in Israel and they're being critical of Israel. I mean, it is shocking the difference between how both sides of government, the left and the right, are responding to this versus how they responded to months and months and months of BLM burning down buildings, causing $2 billion of property damage. I mean, I think that the only conclusion that reasonable, thoughtful people can draw is we are not allowed to criticize Israel in this country.
You know, that's Dave Chappelle, who I love and think is a brilliant social commentator. He's made reference. He said, you know, if it's a group of Black Americans, they're a gang. If it's a group of Italian Americans, it's the mafia. If it's a group of Jewish Americans, you can't say anything at all. It's just a coincidence. So look, as a Jew, I have no problem with criticizing Israel. I think both sides need to tone it down. I think we need to have, like, let's figure this out, guys. And I think it's more than we can comprehend, because we're looking really at, you know, a 1,400-year-old ideological conflict, and we're sitting here trying to apply present-day solutions to a problem that predates us all. But that being said, let me ask you the big question, because, you know, people want to know how this happening 6 months before an election, what impact does this have on the election?
I think that's a very good question, but what I will say is that I haven't thought that Donald Trump was going to win the election in basically years now. I mean, I've just seen mistake after mistake after mistake being made by the right, and we don't have to relitigate all of those. But I don't think this is good for Trump. I really don't. I think that what I see on this is that, you know, and again, I don't take a side on these things. I'm not in any tribe, but from my perspective, it looks to me like college students are trying to stop. Well, I think this is how maybe normies are going to perceive this. Are the college students causing problems? Yeah, they are. But I think that most people know that college students protest. What they see is that we've got people on the left that are trying to, like, fight a righteous fight, where we have people on the right that are calling for these kids to be jailed. They're calling for speech to be censored. I mean, it is ironic that the right is now calling for the censorship of free speech when 4 years ago the right was saying, you know, we have to defend free speech at all costs. I don't think this bodes well for Trump. However, I do think that the protesters could absolutely overplay their hand. I mean, we're in May, we're just starting out the summer, and so there could be a lot of escalations, a lot of problems caused, a lot of, again, fires, riots, all this stuff we experienced. But I don't see Trump winning right now. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that that's how I see it at the moment.
Yeah, but these protesters are as vehemently anti-Biden. I mean, they're not going out and casting votes for Biden, I imagine.
No, they're going out and casting votes for Biden, but they really hate Trump. And I think that it's one of those things where if the American public sees that, you know, if they think that Trump is going to cause more problems than he is going to be able to solve them, then I think that they might vote for Biden by default. But I also don't think Biden's going to be the nominee, and I don't think you guys think Biden's going to be the nominee either. And so it's kind of like a wild card at this point.
Who do you think is going to be the nominee?
Gavin Newsom, probably.
I'm going with Michelle Obama.
You know what I think is going to happen is, I think the way it's going to be set up is that because his cognitive decline at this point, you can't mask it anymore. And look, Carlin, it's funny because, you know, when the economy is good, you don't have to constantly be reminded that it's a good economy. You know it, you feel it, you experience it, you see it in your pocketbook. When you go to the grocery store and a round of groceries for your family is costing over $400 and 4 years ago it was costing you $200, you know something's wrong. So when they get on TV day in and day out, say this is the strongest economy ever, we know that we're being lied to. You experience that. That's one thing. I think if there's one common thread that we as American voters have, is we vote with our wallets. I mean, things going on in DC, most of it's not going to impact your day-to-day life, but inflation, cost, things like that will impact cost at the pump. Those are most Americans are not juiced into the political machine. They're not juiced into the news. They're just going about their lives. They're low information voters. That's the standard. That's the baseline. And if they feel it in their pocketbooks, then that's going to have an impact on our political arena. But you know, that being said, I think that what's going to happen is Biden is going to win the nomination. He's going to be nominated, but he's going to get up there at the convention and he's going to decline the nomination in this great display of statesmanship. And he's going to say, I endorse whomever. I think Michelle Obama, maybe Gavin Newsom, but that way he can preserve some kind of legacy, and the Democrats can say what a great guy, what a statesman. He puts country ahead of himself, and they can make him some kind of martyr. I think you're absolutely right that he's not going to be the nominee. Harlan, as always, we love your insight. We love your commentary. I think you're spot on. I think as we get to the halfway point of the summer, I want to bring you back on so we can see how right you were, and who knows where we're going to be. And I hope we're not all up in flames, because Harlan, I share your fear. If one thing happens, if you get one cop with an itchy trigger finger, or some Antifa kid who lobs a rock at a cop's head and he turns and shoots, or just tases the guy. I mean, look, George Floyd wasn't shot. He was, knelt upon. If something happens, even an accidental death, and I don't believe that Derek Chauvin meant to kill George Floyd. I think it was a number of things. The fact that he was high on fentanyl and meth certainly were contributing factors, but it doesn't matter. The public doesn't want to wait to read the autopsy report. They don't want to wait to see the body cam footage. They want the headline. They want the tweet. Oh my God, a protester has been killed. I think it's going to make 2020 look like a day at the park.
Yeah, I agree, and it's going to be a rocky summer. And again, I really do hope I'm wrong with these predictions. I always hope I'm wrong, but I also think that people need to prepare themselves. And I also think, just to give a warning to people too, what I would say to your audience is, don't go to these protests and try to cause problems. Honest to God, it is actually a dangerous situation. They will actually beat you up, and it's just going to cause more problems. And I know that people want to go and they want to express their point of view. And I don't want to, trample on anyone's right to free speech. You obviously have a right to do that. But I also think that people need to start being smart about this. I'm not going to the college protests. They're happening all around me right now. I'm an hour away from Boston. I could go down to Harvard at any point. But it's just not a good idea. And I think it just provokes things and makes things worse. Someone has got to start being the adult in the room and de-escalating the situation, because both sides are just escalating. And when that happens, the inevitable is an explosion. And so be the adult, don't escalate, let people say what they want to say. And I think if that had just been the way that this had gone from the very beginning, where the college students were allowed to protest, they were allowed to say what they want to say, we would be dealing with a very different situation right now.
Couldn't agree more. Well, Carlin, a pleasure as always. Great to see you guys. If you're not following Carlin, follow her. Subscribe to the Substack. Watch all her content. She's everywhere. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep infiltrating the American left and educating us, because my mind is significantly blown.
Thank you, guys. I'll see you again soon. Have a good one.
See you.
Always, always, always a great guest to have on the stream, because she is in the thick of it, guys. She's in there. She's doing the things that, frankly, I don't care to do, because I just we've got a lot more fortitude than I do.